it's, whoa, the 1st of April. And my time is nearly 7. Still light outside. I like that. That's going to help. Hope everybody's doing okay and staying safe and keeping themselves busy. We're trying. Yeah, let's go on and get this next chapter read. I'm letting you know that this is not a long chapter, but the one that I have to read tomorrow is like twice as long as this one. So I'm just going to read this shorter chapter today, and then we'll do all of the next one that day, instead of trying to double it up and do 2. So this is chapter 10 of The Reaper and the Scribe. A cold breeze made Alicia's facial muscles tighten as she scowled over the empty hold of Albert's boat. With one hand on the tiller and the other on her hip, she looked every bit the helmswoman. As she steered the barge, her mind drifted to her awful discovery of the poor dead children. As awful as it sounded, she knew that the Alicia back in her own time would have thought they have decreased the surplus population. Then she would have simply gone shopping. That thought burned into her brain, and she saw herself now as a duality. I have to change, she thought. I simply cannot go back and be like that again. I am witnessing this for a reason, and if someone or something is going to this much trouble, I must have been heading towards disaster. There must be a connection between the poor children and my old way of living. Alicia came out of her daydream and gripped the tiller firmly. The smile she had started the journey with was back in place as Doris brought her a mug of hot tea. Doris was pleased with Alicia's change in outlook. It was as if she was becoming Alice. Although in Doris's mind she knew that her Alice would be returned to her bosom, and this new Alicia would return to her turbulent times with a new way of thinking. Albert had drawn back the tarpaulins, covering the hold, as the journey was going to be a short one. Doris had joined him on the opposite side of the boat to help. Alicia watched this routine that had been perfected over many years. They were like synchronized dancers as their arms moved in unison, folding back the heavy covering. Again, this brought the thoughts of her own parents to mind, and again, the realization that her father was so on his own with everything. In the cold light of day, she could not believe how she had treated her long-suffering father, and just how evil her mother really was. It was her mother who had sought to alienate her from her father. In fact, it was her mother who had encouraged her to be the way she was. These thoughts were overtaking her brain as she remembered the bad things she and her mother had plotted against that poor, hard-working man. She tried to find a reason why anyone would do this, but the revelations that she was now discovering were surely a pointer to the fact that she was indeed changing her ways. Alicia's solitude at the helm was broken by the crowing of a raven flying overhead as Albert and Doris's synchronized dance drew to a close. Tears welled up in Alicia's eyes, and her bottom lip began to quiver, and then smile at the lovely couple who had stolen her gaze. Doris noted Alicia's eyes first and said, "Whatever is the matter, dear?" I was just thinking of how horrid I've been, and what a wonderful life you and your family share. It is as if a part of me has died and another part is being born. I've never met your Alice, and I'm sure you are truly thankful for that, but it is like I am beginning to see things as she would. The only thing I am worried about now is that when I go back, Alice will leave me, and I will return to that horrible, nasty, useless excuse of a human being that I used to be. She sobbed. Now look here, girl, boomed Albert. You aren't going through all of this for no reason. Somebody or something thought you should get a second chance, and so far you are doing everything right. I reckon when you go back, nobody will even recognize you. Your face may be the same for sure, but the important thing, what is behind your lovely face, will be totally different. You will find people will begin to love you for who you are and not for what you have. And then, little Alicia, you will find peace and happiness, the likes of which you have never known, he continued. But what of Alice? Surely she will not be learning my ways. That'd be awful, answered Alicia. Sorry to say this, but there would be no gain for Alice if that was the case, and I don't think the powers that be would do such a thing to such a sweet angel. I do believe something wonderful is happening for Alice and John, so don't you worry your pretty head about such things. You just concentrate on keeping the boat sure and true. Then, when you go back, you can live your life a new way, was Albert's reassuring answer. Alicia threw her arms as best she could around this great man's girth, burying her head into his chest. Doris smiled and left her man and Ward as she jumped onto the towpath and walked towards young James to retrieve his tea mug and get him on his feet so the horse could once again begin pulling. The crack of the tightening rope once again sent droplets of water up into the air, and the barge began moving forward. An hour of effortless gliding over the canal, leaving a gentle wake behind them, brought the great water mill at Thwaite into view, and the coal stage was looming in front of them. Albert jumped off the boat onto the towpath and untied Toby. James led him to a patch of short winter grass. While Toby munched, Albert walked over the bridge to the other side, and James coiled up the rope, throwing it to Doris on the barge. As soon as Albert was on the other bank, Doris threw the rope to him so he could pull the barge around. With his mighty arms, Albert began to pull. The bow of the barge began to move starboard, and when it pointed across the canal, Albert began to walk up the towpath towards the coal stage. Doris gave Alicia a rope that was tied to the stern and asked if she would throw it to her. As nimble as a young girl, Doris once again jumped onto the towpath, walked a little ways behind the boat, and shouted, "Throw it now!" Alicia threw the rope straight into Doris's awaiting arms. Once again, the husband and wife team worked in perfect unison, mooring the boat directly under the coal chute. As all this was happening, James led Toby over the bridge and into place a few strides in front of the barge. Toby again found a small patch of grass to munch on. As soon as the boat was moored, the large man at the coal chute swung the apparatus over the bow hold. As soon as the coal began to load, a huge plume of black dust engulfed the boat. Alicia saw it heading straight for her at the helm, but there was nothing she could do. It was upon her in an instant. She managed to close her eyes with a millisecond to spare. For some strange reason, the only coughing that could be heard was coming from the helm, as Alicia jumped off the boat and onto the towpath, running out from the cloud of dust. Even though she had managed to close her eyes, they were still red and sore as she rubbed them. She could only imagine what her normally beautifully pampered face looked like now. A few days before, what had just happened would have sent her into a rage. She looked down at her clothes. She had thought they were shabby before, and now they were black and dusty, and she burst into laughter. This was the first time Albert and Doris, or anyone else for that matter, had heard Alicia laugh this way. Scratching his chin, Albert said, "I should have warned you about that." "You did that on purpose," coughed Alicia, still unable to quit laughing. Albert and Doris, the man at the coal chute, and James all burst simultaneously into laughter with her, and even Toby twitched his ears. The coal flowed quickly from the chute, and when the hole was full, the man wrote down in a book the amount of coal he had dispatched, and Albert put his mark upon the document. With 3 of the crew back on the barge, the 4th member made his clicking sound with his mouth, pulled gently on his rope, and the 5th member of the crew began to pull. This time, after the snapping sound the rope made when taut, there was a creaking from it as it stretched, and the barge began to move ever so slowly. "What do we do now? Our lovely clean boat is filthy again," said Alicia. "Don't worry your pretty head about that. Mother Nature will have us clean in no time," said Albert. "Mother Nature?" replied Alicia. "She will blow it off of us," said Albert. To her amazement, she saw that Albert was right, as the settled dust was being blown from not only the boat, but from their clothing too. After an hour, the coal dust was no more, and all that was left was the slight odor of coal on her clothes. Alicia remembered the awful thing she had said about poor Alice's clothes, and felt ashamed of herself. In fact, this strange chain of events was making Alicia ashamed of every single part of her ridiculously spoiled, useless life. Her outlook on everything was completely changing. She began to realize that her brother Jamie's train set thingy and the work involved in trying to restore it was something she should be complimenting him for, not ridiculing him for. She also realized that her father's business was something to be proud of. It was not just a personal bank for her. Most of all, she could see, beyond a doubt, who was the cause, the creator of the Frankenstein's monster that she once was. Her own mother was to blame. This thought had been growing in her mind ever since arriving on the barge. Her mother should have been helping and encouraging her father, not just taking his money and spending it on her personal trainers, with whom she'd had many affairs. Yes, her mother was a complete bitch who needed bringing down a peg or two. This, she swore to herself, would happen the very day she returned to her own time. The wind, now at Alicia's back, helped Toby, as the noble horse towed the now heavy barge. It wasn't long before they were moored once again, outside the same mill where they had moored a couple of days before. "We are early," said Albert. "The job will stop now," he continued. "Why?" said Alicia. "I need your brother back so we can start unloading." "Show me what to do," offered Alicia with a smile. "Nay, lass, it's man's work," he answered with a chuckle. "Not in my time, it isn't, although I'm not a good example of 21st century women. I do have the right to do any work that a man does," she announced quite militantly. "This is a strange time of yours. You can do anything a man can, yet all you do back there is paint your nails. Seems a bit daft to me," he said. "Yes, well, as I said, I'm not a typical woman. But that'll change. Now, show me what to do," she said quite firmly. "All right then, young lass. Follow me," replied Albert, placing a heavy shovel in her hand. The weight of the empty shovel took her by surprise, and she lost her balance and fell fully on her bottom on the hard coal. Normally, she would have burst into tears, but there was a point at stake, and she was going to make the first strike for women's liberation whilst Emmeline Pankhurst was still a baby. Albert helped her to her feet, looking away, because underwear, as Alicia knew, it hadn't been invented yet, and her legs were akimbo. This was a thing that old Alicia would have died from embarrassment from. Instead, she just said, "I'm sure you've seen one of those before, Albert." "Not with legs apart like that, and on my daughter," he replied. Alicia stood up and whispered in his ear, "I'm not your daughter, remember?" "That's true. I was forgetting. You two are so alike now. Alice is always going on about doing John's work," said the embarrassed boat owner. Smiling, Alicia gave him a wink and said, "Why don't you let her? She might be good at it." "Let's see how you get on first," said Albert, as the coal grabber made its way slowly down to the hold. When the grabber gathers the coal and takes it up, we have to make sure there is enough coal in the space where it grabs to get another load. That means we shovel it in, instructed Albert. The apparatus made a deep hole in the coal, and both Albert and Alicia began shoveling. This was a grueling work for Alicia, but she kept her shovel moving. After a while, Jamie returned and saw his sister covered in coal dust, with lines of sweat fingering down her face. He asked what was going on. "We are emptying the barge," said an out-of-breath Alicia. This I can see, but it's hard to believe," said Jamie. "Do you want me to help?" he continued. "No!" screamed Alicia. "We are nearly done, and I want to finish it with Albert," she continued. "All right, I'll go make a pot of tea for us then," said an amazed Jamie. Albert took off his flat cap and scratched his head, saying, "Lasses shoveling coal, lads making tea, the world's turning upside down." Jamie and Alicia burst into laughter. Poor Albert looked bemused as Jamie climbed down into the barge. He picked up the water jug and filled the kettle. Doris was asleep in a chair, but she woke with a start as Jamie placed the lid back onto the kettle. "What on earth is going on here?" she asked. "I'm just making a pot of tea, Doris. Would you like one?" "Stand aside before you burn yourself, you silly man. Men making tea. I've never heard the likes of it," she grumbled. "Go up top. I'll give you a shout when it's ready," she continued. He returned to Albert and Alicia, who were busy shoveling the last of the coal into the large bucket. Jamie was amazed at his sister and so proud of her. Albert put his shovel down as the job finished. He looked at Alicia, who was black with coal dust and wet through with sweat, stooped over with her hands on her knees, totally out of breath, but she wore the broadest grin of satisfaction. Jamie held out his hand to help his sister exit the boat's hold. When he had helped her on deck, he lifted his sister into the air and gave her a loving hug and kissed her on her cheek. He told her how proud he was of what she was doing. She smiled at him, enjoying this sibling intimacy for the first time in her life. "Now then, you two, that's enough of all that. Let's go get cleaned up," interrupted Albert. "I think that's a good idea," answered Alicia. All three of them went downstairs to join Doris and young James. "Come on in, you lot, and have this hot tea. Alice, you come over here. Let's have that dress." "You're filthy," said Doris. Alicia walked across to Doris and held her arms up, as would a child. Doris got a hold of the coal-stained garment and lifted it over her head. Alicia, now wearing only a rather shabby long vest, whispered into Doris's ear, "I'm Alicia. It's getting so I can't hardly tell you two apart. It's as if you and her are the same person," said Doris. "I am enjoying being like Alice, and when she returns, she will live on in me in the 21st century. It's hard for me to understand what is happening, but like Albert, something inside tells me that this situation is not for long, and everything will work out in the end," said Doris. With that, Doris began to wash Alicia's face very gently with a cloth. As the grime was removed, she smiled at Doris. She'd had many facial and beauty treatments, all kinds of expensive pampering, but never had she experienced anything like this. This was like when she was a little girl, only much better. This was loving care, the likes of which she had never known. When she was a girl, this was performed by a nanny, not her mother. Her mother was far too busy to do such mundane tasks. But here was this woman, who she didn't even really know, making her feel warm, clean, and loved. She now knew what was missing in her life, the one thing money could not buy, and Doris was lavishing it upon her. Like a bolt from the blue, Alicia suddenly knew what she needed in her life, and it certainly wasn't money. It was love. She believed she was already beginning to share it with Jamie, and that felt great. But now there was a yearning for deep, caring love, a love that she wanted to give as well as receive, and that feeling engulfed her whole being.